Hi, friends, and welcome to the Smart Catholics show. I'm privileged to be joined by Dr. Pedro Gabriel, all the way from Portugal. I'm in the United States, so it's a whole all the way, but he's put out a new book, and if you have followed along, we have had him back to talk about his previous two books as mini-series on the channel, and we're stoked to sit down with him and talk about his latest book, The Unknown Modern Side of St. Pius X. Now, just that title alone would have probably turned heads if the Holy Father hadn't passed and a new one thrown into the mix and the whole world just sort of up in, everywhere. And so unfortunately we missed incredible value of what this book can bring to us. So here's what I'm going to do. The intro by Dr. Fastigi, I'm going to read that, and then we're going to talk with Pedro about this book and why you should grab it. It's on Kindle. It's on Kindle Unlimited. If you're like me and you've got that and you try to read all the time. Pedro, thanks for joining us. I'm so glad to have you back on.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I'm going to praise you for a minute. I'm going to quote Dr. Fastigi and the brilliant work that you've been doing. Pedro is a medical doctor and a Catholic journalist with a first-rate theological mind. In 2002, he published a book on the orthodoxy of Amoris Laetitia, and he responds with clarity and charity to the critics of Pope Francis' apostolic exhortation on love in the family. And then, 1 year later, he put out a book, Heresy Disguised as Tradition, and he shows how the papal critics of today, who claim to uphold Catholic tradition, actually distort and contradict it, especially by their opposition to legitimate papal authority. And then he put out, the year after that, Rigidity, Faithfulness, or Heterodoxy. He explains why Pope Francis' concerns about rigidity are well-founded. And he goes into the church history with rigorism and how it's tended towards schism or heresy. And then now we come to this century, well, maybe, I don't know, the unknown modern side of St. Pius X. And so Fastigi says this could stand as its own biography of Giuseppe Sarto. But it's more than a biography. It's a historical refutation of the false image of Pius X used by radical traditionalists and conservatives of today. And so that's what I want to chat with you about, because he was a massive figure that I knew pretty much nothing about, actually, growing up as a kid. We always loved to reference him, quote him. Well, Pius X would have, done this or that and so on. And I actually had no idea who he was or what he taught, never read his documents or anything, except that he definitely would not have liked modern popes and all of the, horrible stuff that they get up to. So can you give us a very brief overview of why are we paying attention to this pope from nearly 100 years ago at all?
Yes.
And then I'll have some other questions.
Yes. So Pope Pius X had a very influential papacy, albeit a short one. And in that regard, I think that him and Pope Francis have much in common, because even though both these papacies were sort of less, a little over a decade, they deeply impacted the church. And in the conclusion of the book, I even cite a historian that says that many of the things now today that we take for granted, they can be traced back to Pius X. Like, for example, the fact that people take communion daily, or the fact that children can have their first communion, or even the curia as we have it today. It came much from the reforms of Pius X. So his papacy was, or the liturgical reforms can also be traced to Pius X. So many things today, we owe it to Pius X. And so this book tries to highlight how he is still someone that we should pay attention today. But unfortunately, he also has been hijacked for more nefarious purposes, in that he was the Pope that fought most strongly against the heresy of modernism. And by doing so, actually saved we cannot say that he saved the church, because only Jesus saves the church, but he allowed the church to pass through the challenges of his day without falling into a very, very serious error. But the problem is that people nowadays confuse modernism with modernity. And so they are going to use what Pius X wrote about modernism to attack the modern church, because they have this idea that modernism and modernity are the same thing. But in fact, if you actually read what he wrote, you will see that the modern church does not fulfill the criteria for modernism. It's mostly a confusion that has been created by these people.
Agreed. So can we talk more about, I want to ask more about this hijacking, like you say. If he was somebody who was so influential, upset a lot of apple carts, and probably drew a lot of attention and possibly anger and closed door sessions and whatever, they just didn't have Twitter back then, so we didn't hear about it, I suppose. So let's talk about the hijacking, and then I want to come back and ask for a definition of modernism, because you've continued to do very fascinating things with that I've been grateful for, such as how modern traditionalism is actually very modernist, and I love that. Yes. It was a great article. So we'll end by talking about what is modernism and how it's not just an old thing from back before the communists, but it's a real living thing today that we struggle with in our parishes. But let's talk about him and how his papacy was hijacked, and how, what is it? They played a game of selective talking points with him?
Well, it's mostly because, it's very easy to confuse these two words because they're so similar. And many of the people who are doing this hijacking, they don't have a particular philosophical background or theological background. So they tend to make these kinds of associations without paying attention to the nuances. But one of the things that Pius X did was actually systematize what modernism was. He wrote an entire encyclical, Pascendi Dominici Gregis, that was precisely about defining what modernism is, so that we can more accurately know where their errors lie. So if you follow this, then you will see that the modern church does not fulfill the criteria for modernism, because modernism has a very precise definition that Pius X actually took. One of his greatest contributions was to provide this definition. Even the modernists themselves actually, praise Pius X for providing this systematization, because before there was no concept of modernism as it was. It was mainly an abstract set of ideas, but it was not seen as a coherent whole. And St. Pius X was the one that was able to make it a coherent whole, so that we can most accurately know why it is wrong. And modernism was very, very dangerous because it placed in doubt the very notion of dogma itself. For modernists, everything in the church should adapt to the modern mindset, even dogma. And we can think about, usually we have this idea of dogma, of something dead. Our modern sensibilities have a certain anti-dogmatism toward it. But imagine, if we are against dogma, then if a society evolves so that forgiveness is seen as something for the weak, they will say, well, what Jesus said about forgiveness must adapt to our culture that does not see forgiveness as something good, for instance. So if dogma is something that can adapt so much that it can mean the opposite, then that means that our faith does not have a solid foundation. But the problem is that the modern traditionalists think that this applies to the church, but it doesn't, because it's not just a mere adaptation. Pius X himself said that we must adapt in everything that can adapt. It's mostly about not contradicting revealed truths. And this the modern church has not done. But traditionalists will believe that the church has done so. And that's where the hijacking comes from. The modern traditionalists trace this supposedly change of the revealed truths of the church to the Second Vatican Council. And the first uproot of rebellion against the Vatican Council came from Lefebvre, Archbishop Lefebvre, who entered into schism by creating, out of his own volition, the Society of St. Pius X. And as soon as he did this, St. Pius X became associated with this rebellious movement, and that's how his hijacking started. So that nowadays, people who are against the modern church, but who don't subscribe to the Society of St. Pius X, well, they still use St. Pius X for their endeavors. That's how much his image has been hijacked for this purpose.
I'm curious what your thoughts would be, because the sense that I have of how he's routinely quoted, like you say, they hijacked who he wanted to be, who he was, to become someone very autocratic and triumphalist. What would your reply to that be? Beyond obviously saying, well, get your book.
Yeah. No, I wanted to also to undo that image of St. Pius X, because it is true that he had, because modernism had become so widespread and it was so destructive, he took measures that were very harsh against modernism. And in that sense, people might see him as autocratic. And in fact, some of these harsh measures actually backfired. So his successor, Benedict XV, had immediately to tune it down a bit. But he was not like that all the time. In fact, there were people who were surprised that St. Pius X was so harsh on modernism, because that's not who he was. He used to be and he was a gentle soul who tried to reach out to the sinners, and sometimes being harsh, as many people at that time used to be, but also trying to, as much as possible, to exhaust every possible venue before going to the harsh punishments. And my book also deals with that. He was able, through diplomatic venues, to thaw the frozen relations between the church and many secular and anti-clerical regimes. And regarding some schismatics that he also had to deal with, like the Mariavites, who followed, well, we can say that they were the traditionalists of their day, because they followed a private revelation that was not approved, and that for them, they were the ones who were following tradition. Even towards them, he tried as much as possible to reach out to them. And even when dealing to the bishops, writing to the bishops, he said, try them as much as possible when they repent to bring them back in. So he was only harsh when he needed to be, when all other options were exhausted. Even in Pascendi Dominici Gregis, he says that at first he tried to be kind towards modernists, but it was the modernists who bit his hand. So Pius X was not by default a harsh person. He would try as much as possible to do it the right way, the gentle way. But the problem is that he was living in an age in which that was not enough in most cases. And that's also how I feel about Pope Francis, because Pope Francis tried to build bridges, tried to reach out to everyone. But because of that, there was this locus of resistance that tried to resist every single thing that he did every step of the way. So even though that was not his nature, he had to be harsh on them, because they were corroding his efforts precisely to allow the church to grow and reach the peripheries. So I can sense here, both in St. Pius X and Francis, very big similarities, in which both of them were bridge builders, but both of them had the courage to make the hard decisions when it needed to be taken.
Amazing. Thank you. Let's talk about modernism, because obviously if this is the whole thing that he's focusing on, and it hasn't gone away, because we just keep layering things and we don't actually resolve things. So how are we still struggling with modernism today? And why does that mean this book is even more helpful for, like, every, as with previous books, every student, seminarian, high schooler should be reading the books that you're putting out to sort themselves, orient themselves into how to place the church in history, and then in where, her journey, where she is today. So let's talk about, what is modernism as an idea, and why are we struggling?
Yeah. So I would say that we are not struggling with the exact kind of modernism that Pius X was struggling with. There's still lots of modernism in the academia, but it comes mostly from a secular perspective on reality. But the modernists were Catholics, or they believe themselves to be Catholics. So what Pius X has shown was that modernism stemmed from two sources. And these two sources would act in conjunction, that producing then all the attitudes that we saw from modernists from across the board. So one of these roots was agnosticism, in which even though the modernists believed themselves to be Catholics, they thought that there was no ability for us to actually know. So there was some agnosticism. That's the word that Pope Pius X uses. And then this creates a vacuum that is then replaced with something that is called vital immanentism, in which, we might not be able to know God, but we might not know whether God exists with scientific certainty, but we can know God as he exists in the works that he has performed in man. So the idea is that God reveals himself in man and through man. So God is immanent in his creation. We can just see God in his creation, in his fellow man, in the church, like that, which would be okay if it did not deny the transcendent. If you were agnostics, we are only immanent, we are not transcendent. But God does not exist just in man. He does not exist just in nature. He transcends man. He transcends nature. He is his own person. He's actually three persons, but you get my drift. So, is his own being. So he is not just limited to his creatures. And so, if he is not just man, he cannot change according to the changeable nature of man. And therefore, there are eternal, immutable truths. Now, if you want to argue that the church is modernist, these two characteristics must be necessarily present. The modern church should be agnostic and should be purely immanentist, not advocate for a transcendent God. But if you read anything that the church has put forward from the Second Vatican Council onward, including Pope Francis, we see that the church is not agnostic. The church professes the faith that God exists and we can know him. And the church is not purely immanentist. Surely we can see God in his creation. We can see God in our brothers. We can see God in the church. But the church also advocates that God is transcendent. He is beyond our time, beyond space, beyond our capacities to reason. And the church has never denied dogma, which is something that the modernists did, because for the modernists, we don't have access to what God is besides what we see in the changeable nature of man. So if man changes, then every truth of the faith changes with man, including dogma. So what we have here is just an association between the fact that modernists advocated that the church must adapt to the modern times, and since the Second Vatican the Second Vatican Council also agreed that the church must adapt, then this is modernism. But the crucial difference is that the modernists said that everything was up for grabs. Dogma was up for grabs. But the church does not say that everything is up for grabs. The church says that we must adapt in what can be adaptable, that we express eternal truths, but through new languages, because languages change, the eternal truths do not. And this is something, and I prove it in my book too, that Pius X also said. He had an encyclical, Il Fermo Proposito, in which he said the church can change everything that is changeable to adapt in order to be able to more effectively spread this message. So if the Second Vatican Council Church is modernist, Pius X was also modernist there.
Would you say that Pius X either broke ground or laid fresh groundwork that on this concept of adaptability or adaptation that would then lead us to be able to have something like the Second Vatican Council? Would you say he was this catalyst that allows us this new, can you say, a concept of the development of doctrine? Or is that a different topic?
I wouldn't say that, because Pius X was not the keenest person on the doctrinal development, but he but he still accepted that doctrinal development exists. So that's proven in the book. So for Pius X, doctrinal development exists, but you will not see much groundwork being laid out for doctrinal development because the church usually is trying to fight an error. So the church wobbles in one direction and wobbles into the other. At that moment, there was too much adaptability. So the church tried to highlight more the eternal truths. But then the fact that the church had grown out of tune with the modern world and needed to evangelize this modern world made it wobble back because some adaptability was needed. I would say that Pius X laid the groundwork for the Vatican II Church, and I have a whole section of the book devoted to that. In other areas, in secondary areas, like, for example, Pius X was a person who was very keen on the concept of the universal call to holiness. And that's also a very important point of the Second Vatican Council. Pius X was very keen on the vocation of the lay people to go out into the world and evangelize. That's also what the Second Vatican Council says. Pius X was very keen that we needed to reform the liturgy. And we should reform the liturgy by going back to the sources, ressourcement. And the Second Vatican Council also argued that we should undergo a liturgical reform on the same sense. So St. Pius X laid the groundwork for many of the things that came out of the Second Vatican Council, though I would say that doctrinal development was not properly the place where, or the topic where he contributed the most. But he left the door open for that. So we cannot say that by developing doctrine that we are going against St. Pius X. In order for us to be going against St. Pius X, we must develop doctrine in a way that contradicts Pascendi. And that's something that is often assumed but not proven.
Fantastic. Pedro, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us about your book. Where can people find you online and get a copy of this book?
Well, the people can get a copy from my book from Amazon. They have it in English and also in Portuguese. Just go to Amazon.com or the Amazon that is more present in your country and search the unknown modern side of St. Pius X, Pedro Gabriel, and you will find it there. I would also recommend that people who are interested in this book and in others can go to my website, pedrogabrielwriter.com, and there they will find all information about this book and all other books.
Friends, I will link in the description to these. Follow Pedro on YouTube. You can follow his project, The Cross in the World. I think you're
the city
and writing on that?
The city and the world.
City and the World. You have a YouTube channel. You're putting out a book a year at this point. What's next for you? Do you have plans for a new book? You're taking some time off.
At this moment, I don't have, but let's see what God
will give you another month.
Yeah.